Okay, so how is it that we do know math is true? And again, we're just looking at this as an example of the sort of question that Meno's paradox does still seem to be binding for. How is it that we can grasp how these concepts relate to one another without simply pointing? Well, we have to demonstrate it by writing out systems of axioms, which are basically just definitions of concepts. That's all an axiom really is in this sense. And what we then try to do, right, and we're assuming here that we're mathematicians, is we try to show that other mathematical concepts follow from these basic definitions that we write. Here's the thing though, we have to assume that the definitions that we write out are true. We can't actually prove them. And again, just simply pointing at something out there in the world doesn't prove that any of these definitions are correct. So you've maybe heard of one famous axiomatization, that's Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory. And here the definitions focus on the idea of sets, which some philosophers have actually compared to universals, interestingly enough. Now here's the thing, with this particular axiomatization, and all of the others, we have not even been able to prove that any one of these theories is itself consistent. What does that mean? Well, it means that we can't prove that any of the axioms in any one of these sets of axioms doesn't actually contradict any other axiom. So that's a big problem, right? And some logicians, including Gödel, have actually argued that if math is in the end consistent, then we'll never actually be able to use math to prove that there aren't any inconsistencies within itself, right? So this is called the incompleteness theorem. You may have heard of that, or you may want to look that up if this interests you. So back to the idea here, though, in mathematical logic, a set theory effectively works like a definition. Even though we can't prove it, right? Even though we're assuming it. Why? Because what it does is it identifies the formal properties or the essential properties of a number, right? Or in the case of set theory, a group of numbers without paying any attention to specific individual numbers that are in that group. So how do we sort of defend the assumptions that lead to these mathematicians axiomatizations? Well, they arrive at them by using reason and intuition, right? It seems in your head like 2 plus 2 equals 4 is just not thinkable any other way. To say 2 plus 2 equals 5 just seems ludicrous. It seems wrong, right? And it seems like just reason and intuition give you that. So when they write out these definitions, they're using reason and intuition to come up with their material. But again, the idea here, right, and the reason why I went through this whole explanation of how it is that we know math is true is the point is that these formal properties in math are what I want to link to the idea of a form in Platonic philosophy, right? So the idea of the form of one, or the idea of the form of four, or even if we switch to geometry and say the form of a triangle or the form of a rectangle, we want to compare that to the idea of the form of beauty, the form of virtue, the form of justice, the form of goodness, right? So one thing that I want to note that I haven't yet told you, and you don't really actually get from the Meno dialogue itself, is for Plato, the form of the good is kind of like the highest form of all. It's even higher than justice and beauty. It's more important than mathematical form. So in a way, it's kind of like God in Platonic philosophy, in Platonism. And in fact, in the early years of Christianity, a lot of Platonic philosophy was actually sort of transmitted into Christianity. So you could say that this idea of the form of the good is linked conceptually to the Christian idea of God. Of course, this form of the good doesn't hear prayers or condemn sin or anything like that. So there are differences. But we want to turn back to the text itself here and take a look at how these ideas of forms relate to the idea of knowledge and how we acquire knowledge. And remember, we were specifically focusing on virtue, but really the issue here is really quite broad. So this comes up when Meno asks Socrates to elaborate on why it is that the paradox is unsound, to go into more detail, to tell him why. And Socrates is basically going to quote a poet. He's going to quote this guy Pindar and basically reference this idea that the soul is eternal, that the soul never dies, that it's immortal, we could say. That's at 81b. And the idea here is that you are born at some point in time and you do die. but the soul itself, right? The part of you that's really you. And a lot of religions believe something really close to this, right? It's actually never destroyed. But it's not just the case that this soul continues on after you die, but it's the case that the soul existed even before you were born, right? And that you go through periods of rebirth, right? So in a way, this kind of looks like a theory of reincarnation, which some Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies take to heart. And again, kind of similar to certain Eastern philosophies and religions, Socrates says here that because you live eternally, some of these ancient poets and ancient holy people in ancient Greece argued that you should try to live as holy or as pious of a life as possible, because where you end up in the next life, right, the next pairing for your soul may depend on how you lived in this life. If you're wicked, you may be punished by the universe, and if you live a good and holy life, you may find yourself elevated, right? You may be come back as a king or something like this. But let's focus on the conceptual epistemological importance here, right? The idea is that because the soul is immortal, you've also already seen everything that there is to see. You know everything that there is that's out there, right? There isn't anything left for you to learn. And if this is true, then you don't have to buy into that debater's argument, as Socrates calls it, the paradox that Meno gives him, right? There's a sense in which you don't find that inquiry is unnecessary or impossible, right? And the problem is you realize you have questions, and you also realize that you don't have the answers. And that's going to be kind of the issue here. If you always existed, how do we forget, right? How is it that we ever come to lose this knowledge that we have, right? And there's all sorts of explanations for that. That's something for you to think about. But Socrates says here on 81e that this debater's argument, Meno's paradox, is going to make people lazy. It's going to make people weak. It says, don't bother trying to learn anything. Don't bother trying to know anything, right? It's unnecessary or it's impossible. He says, if you believe my theory that the soul is eternal and that you recall things rather than learning them for the first time, right? This is something that empowers you. This is something that is motivating, right? This is something that doesn't make you idle like the paradox does. So Socrates will try to demonstrate to Meno why the theory of recollection is true. And he'll try to do this, right, in a way that isn't actually like teaching it to him, right? The idea is that he has to get Meno to remember, right, that this is the way knowledge works. Otherwise, he's kind of arguing in this contradictory way. So Socrates takes this slave boy, and he says that I'm going to show you that the theory of recollection is true by engaging with this slave boy and showing you that he knows mathematical truths, despite the fact that he has no formal education, despite the fact that no one has taught him about math. And I'm not going to teach this boy anything. I'm just going to draw in the sand, and I'm going to question him. And people always debate the extent to which Socrates is only questioning and is maybe kind of leading him in a certain way with his questions, which of course would kind of look like teaching. So the point here is that Socrates gets this boy, this slave boy, to realize that he doesn't know what he thinks that he knows. This is kind of a subtle point here, but the boy at first, despite his lack of formal education, thinks that he knows what Socrates wants him to say and says it, and he actually gives the wrong answer. And the significance of this is at 85c, as Plato writes, the man who does not know still has within himself true opinions about the things that he does not actually know. Right? So the boy doesn't really know the correct answer, but he does have kind of some correct assumptions. He does have true opinions about the figure that Socrates draws in the sand, this rectangle that he divides up using a bunch of lines and creates a bunch of small little triangles in the sand, right? The boy does have some true opinions that are going to lead him toward the right answer. And eventually the boy does come to the correct answer after Socrates asks him more questions. So I don't want to focus on the specifics of the figure that Socrates draws in the sand or anything like that. You can actually look on YouTube for illustrated cartoon versions of that if that interests you. I want to skip over that and just say, I think we can all agree that it seems like during this part of the text, the boy does know something. So the boy either always knew what he knows, or he acquired this knowledge at some specific point in time. And that latter alternative is, I think, the one that most of us assume is the way knowledge works, right? You learned math at a specific point in time. You didn't just recall it like Plato claims. You learned at a specific point in time what it means to have a good friend or something. You didn't always know it, although that's what Socrates and Plato would have said in this dialogue, right? So let's just go with Socrates for a minute here and assume that it's correct that no one actually taught this boy geometry. If that's the case, then he must have always known it. And maybe Socrates cheated. Maybe he led him this certain way with questions. But let's assume that he doesn't. Let's assume he didn't bend the rules here and he really only asked questions and the boy kind of arrived at the answer on his own. What this would mean is that the boy always existed, right? But not always as a human. His soul always existed. And it's his soul's knowledge that predates his physical existence, predates his physical being, right? And this soul is what the boy really is. This soul is what knows about mathematics. This soul is what accounts for the fact that this boy, who never was taught math, is able to answer these questions correctly that Socrates gives him about the figure in the sand. So a lot of us are going to think this just seems nuts. This seems absurd. Most of us aren't going to believe that our souls are eternal in the way Plato suggests, even if some of us do believe that the soul will continue after we die, right? It's kind of an unusual belief in the West, at least, to think that your soul existed before you were born. But let's try to make as much sense of it as we can. Let's be what in philosophy and the liberal arts is called charitable, meaning let's try to make the argument make as much sense as possible before we try to question it, before we challenge it or condemn it. So we're going to use reason in reverse. I think this is the best way to go about this. If not for some sort of part of us that existed always, right? And maybe you don't even want to say that it's a soul. Maybe you want to say it's like some energy that's part of you, right? Something that was always part of the universe, was there since the beginning of time. If something like that didn't exist, right? How else are we able to really reasonably explain how it is that we know mathematical truths, right? Especially when we look at people who aren't educated and are able to perform these operations, who are able to come up with the answers here, just using reason and intuition. It gets really hard to prove this, right? And as I said earlier, we can't really prove this just by pointing at things or using empirical methods of observation. And even if it's true that existence is finite, meaning that it's limited, right? Meaning that you don't exist forever, that you're not eternal or something like this, then how else are we really going to explain, right, how it is that mathematics just seems to be true, right? And these mathematicians write out accounts of axiomatizations and groups of definitions and set theories that show how math is true, right? While at the same time, we don't want to say any of us just invented it. We don't just want to say that it's like other languages maybe that were created by people and were modified over time or something. Math just seems different. And when I use this term here, a priori validity, a priori just means before experience, right? Math is something that seems to predate all human experience. It seems to be something that was always there. You probably are familiar with this famous quote from Galileo where he says, mathematics is like the language of the cosmos. The very universe seems to be written out of the language of math. So Socrates actually admits, he points out to Meno that he isn't sure he's right, but he would rather believe that he is right instead of taking that skeptical position encapsulated in the paradox. He would rather believe in an eternal soul. He would rather believe in the theory of recollection than he would believe that inquiry is impossible or that it's unnecessary. And it's at this point in the dialogue that the two will actually return to their original investigation concerning virtue. And we find here that Socrates introduces a new method. Compared to the method of questioning that he used in dialogues like the Euthyphro, or even in the first part of this dialogue, the Meno, Socrates is going to present something that he calls the hypothetical method. It's also sometimes called the geometrical method. And all it is arguing in a series of steps, right? Where your steps are going to build on top of one another and you're going to work towards true conclusions. It's a lot like the proofs that you may see in a geometry class, right? And the difference here is Socrates used to the character, right? He used to use this method just of asking questions. He would never try to teach people. He didn't believe that teaching was possible. He thought that people had to acquire their own knowledge, even if all they could acquire was the knowledge that they knew nothing, right? You don't know what you think you know, this classic line attributed to Socrates. So Socrates is going to, in this dialogue written by Plato, use this new method that doesn't really reflect the sort of methods that we think the actual real-life Socrates would have used. So the first thing they're going to start with is this question, is virtue knowledge? And at 87e, they say, if then there is anything else good that is different and separate from knowledge, then virtue might well not be a kind of knowledge. But if there is nothing good that knowledge does not encompass, then we would be right to suspect that it is a kind of knowledge. So Meno and Socrates agree. Virtue is something in the soul, and it is something that is good, it's something that's beneficial, and if both of those are true, then it has to be knowledge. Why do they say this? Well, they insist that all of the soul's qualities or attributes or properties are, on their own, neither good or bad, right? They don't benefit or harm somebody just on their own. It's this other thing, virtue, or this other thing again, vice, that makes these qualities beneficial or harmful. The idea here, just to use an example, being food is good unless you eat too much of it, and then it's bad. Same with exercise. You exercise too much, you can collapse and die, right? It doesn't seem that any of these things on their own are either beneficial or harmful. But if we agree that virtue is a type of knowledge, and Meno and Socrates did, for the moment at least, agree on this point, remember how we first began this question. Is it knowledge that's taught? Is it knowledge that's practiced? Or is it knowledge that's natural or innate? Notice that we still have teaching on the table, even after the paradox, even after Socrates, the character, by way of Plato, sort of tried to argue that you never really are taught anything, that you only recall things. But Socrates here points out at 86d, whoa, Meno, look at what we're doing. Look at how this compares to your paradox. What are we doing? We're inquiring into the qualities of something, the nature of which we don't know, right? Which the paradox says is impossible. The paradox says you can't do that. You can't look for something if you don't know what you're looking for. But here, they know the question, right? They know the problem. They just don't know the solution. They don't know the answer. So they're able to proceed in this manner. So we'll start here at 87e with this articulation of the possibilities, right? So if virtue is knowledge, then it's either teachable or not teachable. But if knowledge is really only of good things, right, this highest form, then it has to be B. It can't be teachable. Why? Well, as far as Socrates is concerned, you can't be taught the good. The good is something that you recall, right? And there's furthermore, noted at 87e, this issue again, as we already saw, that the qualities of the soul on their own are neither good or bad, right? Sometimes a good thing can harm you. Sort of like the flip side of that idea that no one desires to be bad. So the point here is that we have to know what to do. We have to know how to be wise, in other words, if we want happy souls. And if we have to know what to do, right, then we have to have knowledge of the good, right? And they're saying that this isn't teachable. So despite the fact that it isn't teachable, at 88d we see this line that virtue must be a kind of wisdom, right? And it's either the whole thing, meaning it's the same thing, or it's a part of it. So as I gave you a few minutes ago, you have these examples of things that concern certain specific types of wisdom, specific types of virtue, knowing not to eat too much or exercise too much. Maybe somebody taught you these things, right? These are maybe not the best examples, but if we go up the ladder of forms, right? If we imagine it as a hierarchy where you have empirical questions, empirical problems closer to the bottom, and then the higher up you go, you have things like knowledge of beauty and justice and virtue, and at the very top of the pyramid we have the good, or God, as I told you earlier. The higher we go up that pyramid, the less likely it is that you were taught your knowledge of this thing, right? Even if you think that your parents are the ones who taught you what's good, even if you think your priest or your imam or your guardian or your neighbor or your friend is the one who taught you this, or your teacher or your professor, right? It seems ultimately like it's something that wasn't just transmitted to you from this other person. And if Plato's right about how knowledge works, then that's absolutely not the case. So we're going to say here, we're going to say that it's settled, at least for now, that virtue is knowledge, but it doesn't look like it's taught. And we'll return to that. But remember, our other options here are maybe it's practiced and maybe it's natural. So the interesting thing in the dialogue is they kind of skip over the idea that virtue is practiced. You won't see very much discussion of that possibility at all. They skip pretty much immediately to this idea that maybe goodness is something that's innate. But they're going to dismiss it, at least for a brief point in time here, for the reason that the argument is if we were good by nature, right, if we were just innately good, some people were just born that way, in other words, then presumably there would be older people who were also good and would be able to pick out or identify youths or children who were also good. And the idea here is these people don't exist. That's what the dialogue at least tells us. But if we try to be charitable, right, we try to make this make as much sense as we can before we dismiss it, we would say maybe it's the case that these older people who are good by nature are able to identify natural goodness, right? Maybe we just haven't met these people despite the fact that we don't know of anybody like this. Maybe they are out there, right? Maybe we just aren't able to tell who they are if we're the ones who don't know what the good is, or we're the ones who haven't yet recalled if Plato's right about how knowledge works. So they dismiss this and decide that they're going to return back to this theory that maybe it's something that's taught. They're, again, going to skip over the possibility that it's practiced and return to the original possibility. But basically what happens here is Socrates stops and he says to Meno, hey, wait a second, what if we weren't right about our conclusions about the teachers of virtue, the teachers of goodness? Maybe we need to go back and check our work, in other words. And they approach this problem by bringing in a guy who's sitting next to them named Anytus, and they're going to see what Anytus thinks about the situation, have some fresh eyes, take a look at the issue or the question, so to speak. And the question here is, are there any people who teach virtue? If we assume that there aren't any people who can teach a subject, if we assume that there aren't any people who can learn a subject, then it seems to be the case that this subject can't be taught, right? For example, and they don't give you this in the dialogue, of course, because it was too early, but before calculus was developed by Leibniz and Newton, it couldn't have been taught, it couldn't have been learned, right? So that they do seem to be right here. It's an assumption, but it seems to be a good one. And they ask briefly, again returning to figures like Gorgias, are maybe the sophists teachers of virtue? Are maybe even fathers teachers of virtue to their sons? They look at this specific example of one father, Thucydides, who was very wealthy and tried to educate his sons in all things, in every subject, in every discipline. But very famously he failed. They turned out to be these horrible, wicked guys who just couldn't do anything right, who did a lot of bad things. And they seem to think that's a good counterexample, right? That virtue can't be taught. This guy tried as hard as he could to teach his sons to be good and just failed miraculously. So the interesting thing here is in this conversation with Anytus, we actually see him get pretty angry. Socrates kind of insists again that they do seem to be right, that it seems that virtue cannot be taught, and Anytus disagrees. Anytus thinks that it can be taught, and he gives this kind of ominous line where he says that you should be careful. You should watch what you say going around these parts saying these sorts of things to people. You're going to get in trouble. And this definitely foreshadows what would eventually happen to Socrates. As you know, he would find himself at court, as we saw in Euthyphro, accused of corrupting the youth, making up gods, denying the Greek gods that were established. So we could say, right, you may have heard of Plato's cave, this famous metaphor or allegory from the Republic. It seems here like Plato wants to tell us that Anytus is still in the cave. He's still chained. He's only facing a wall, viewing shadows. He's angry. He gets personally offended when someone who has true knowledge comes down to him and tries to tell him the way that things really are. So Meno will actually come back in here and try to defend this theory that Socrates is pushing against, that virtue is something that could be taught. Meno says that he knows of teachers of virtue, but he says these teachers actually themselves disagree about whether virtue can be taught. And Socrates says, well, that's a problem, right? He says on 96b, can you imagine any other subject where people who claim to be teachers not only are not recognized to be teachers of it by others, but aren't recognized to have knowledge of it themselves, right? And furthermore, some people even think that these teachers are poor in the very matter in which they profess to teach. Or can you think of any other subject of which those who are recognized as worthy teachers at one time say it can be taught, and at other times say that it cannot? And that's, of course, the line that Meno just explicitly said to Socrates. But he's right here, right? This is an obvious problem. You wouldn't have someone who's a carpentry teacher who says that his craft is teachable, and at another time says that it cannot. You wouldn't have a math teacher who says on one day that math can be taught, and on another day that it can't. And you wouldn't have, also, if we look at it a different way, you wouldn't have a group of math teachers lined up where half of them would say math can be taught and the other half would say that it can't, right? It just doesn't seem right. Now, of course, again, we're presupposing that Platonic recollection is wrong, right? Because if it's right, then no one teaches math at all, right? No one learns it, and no one is taught it. So they kind of agree then that it seems that virtue can't be taught. But they're going to move to one of the last important points here at the end. And what we're looking at here is, as I said earlier, true opinion versus knowledge. They turn to this question after kind of agreeing that it seems that virtue is something that can't be taught, to this difference, this distinction between a true opinion and actual knowing of something. And what we want to take away from this is Plato shows us in the dialogue that knowledge is always the goal, right? Knowledge is always what we want. Knowledge is always our ideal. But we do find that true opinion has some purposes. True opinion can be really helpful. How? Well, it can lead us in the right way, even if you're not certain about something, right? Let's say you have a true opinion about something you don't know, right? You know, in other words, that you've got a question. This is different from completely lacking knowledge and not being able to search out this knowledge, right? This is why we're able to avoid the paradox. But the real takeaway here is that you don't always have to have knowledge in order to be good, right? You can sometimes have true opinion and work towards virtuous action, work towards being a good person. And this is something we don't want to forget. Plato thinks that it's worth mentioning because it's kind of subtle, right? We kind of have knowledge on a pedestal. We think knowledge is the sole sort of desire here, but he very much is contesting this. So Meno hears this, and Meno says, well, okay, Socrates, so isn't true opinion then just as good as knowledge? And Socrates says no. Socrates says the problem with true opinions, as helpful as they are, is that they're shifty. They can move around just like the statues of Daedalus, which is a reference to a myth. And until you pin these statues down, right, these statues that are so real, so lifelike that they move around at night, and you come back the next morning and you're gone, right, you can't really trust them, right? You can, again, work towards trying to know things. You can work towards being virtuous, work towards being good. But until you pin down these true opinions through recollection, through trying to recall, right, you can't really say that these true opinions are on the same level as knowledge, that they're just as good. So a few things here at the end. First 90 to 92 are very, very good recap, particularly since this dialogue is quite a bit longer and more complex than everything else that we've read so far. Next, you have something kind of big and surprising happen at the end. Despite, and this is why I kind of foreshadowed this earlier, despite the fact that the two characters, Socrates and Meno, seemed earlier in the dialogue to say that virtue is a type of knowledge, and they wondered what type, they're at the end actually going to conclude that it's not knowledge at all, right? Why? Because it can't be taught. So why does Plato use this own proof when his own theory holds that knowledge is not taught but remembered is kind of obscure to me. It does seem a bit inconsistent with this position. It's just an odd sort of way to put it, given his own theories about how knowledge works. But if it's true that virtue is actually not knowledge because it can't be taught, well, then we have a big takeaway, and that is now we know why good people can't make other people be like themselves. They can't teach it. They can't show other people how to practice it, right? It seems like something that just is completely non-transmittable. And this is also how we can account for mix-ups over what's good, right? Remember, again, we talked about how no one, according to Plato, desires to be bad. And these people just have different ideas of what's good, even if it's taking over the earth or killing people, right? They just have a different opinion. Well, if virtue is not knowledge, then we can kind of come across the explanation for that. We kind of have an answer for why that occurs. And what's weird, what's kind of unsatisfactory or a bit off-putting here at the end, is the dialogue suggests that people who are virtuous just happen to be right, right? If these people really are virtuous people, if they really are what they claim they are, then it seems like they've just been given a gift. It seems like they just have something that was given to them by God or by the gods, that they just got lucky, that they just coincidentally happened to be a virtuous person. Right? So they say virtue isn't knowledge, but they do at the end kind of hint that for at least some people, it is innate. It is something that is just natural. It's something that's there.